Welcome, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you across the globe who joined today's Tech Talk series. Today's session is about a very wonderful topic, discussing how does hiring women as leaders change gender stereotypes, some insights from machine learning. My name is Yip. I'm an MBA 17D graduate, and most of my tenure at INSEAD in the Singapore campus. And want to say thank you very much for Accenture for giving us the opportunity to create space for learning and discussion together. What is TechX Talks? Tech Talks are both technical and business talks presented by leading technologists, thought leaders, industry practitioners, innovators, and entrepreneurs, and of course, beloved INSEAD faculty. Tech Talks expands a wide spectrum of topics on both emerging and existing technologies and provides technology-specific insights as well as management, business, and societal perspectives. You can find more information about Tech Talk X and the upcoming events at Digital at INSEAD. And thank you again, Accenture, for providing this opportunity for us to convene and have insightful conversations. Thank you very much again for participating and sharing your precious time with us today. I want to welcome our precious guest today, Professor Asher Lawson, who is an assistant professor of decision sciences at INSEAD Business School. He holds a PhD from the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University and a BA from the University of Oxford. His research investigates the biases in how people make decisions and how we can improve those decisions with targeted interventions. In his work, he has focused on two main topics: the errors in how people make decisions in general, and the role of gender stereotypes in organizational decision-making. On the first topic, he has focused on how people frame the problems they are trying to solve, the limits of deliberative thinking in improving decision-making, as well as the behavioral consequences of overconfident beliefs and the differences in how people make risky decisions. In the second line of work, he has used machine learning to study the effects of hiring women into leadership positions on stereotypes in organizational language and how the effectiveness of leadership styles varies by the gender of the leader. His current focus is on the relationship between organizations' use of language and women's experiences in the workplace. More broadly, he is interested in the factors that lead to people holding accurate perceptions of information, decisions, and groups, and the integration of insights from behavioral science into analytical tools. With that said, I would love to welcome Professor Asher to share the insights from his latest research project. It's an absolute honor to have you here with us. And I'm more than excited to be facilitating the Q&A session at the end of your presentations. And everyone, you are very welcome to use the chat and the Q&A functions to share your questions and your feedback. Thank you so much.
Hello, welcome to this talk. Today, I'm delighted to be sharing with you some of the insights from machine learning from my research about the benefits of hiring women into leadership positions. I'm going to start at a bit of a higher level. So we hear the word data a lot now. There's this idea of the data economy, where companies are tasked not only with maximizing the value of their own data, but also maximizing the value of the data from other companies in their ecosystem. And they have to ask themselves questions like, what should we measure? What kind of data should we collect? Once we have that data, how should we use it? What kind of analysis can we do? How can we improve our business using this? As well as this, they can think about how to strategically share data and what data that they need from other companies. This emphasis on data has been shown to have great value to companies. So just to give you a few statistics, it's associated with a 58% increase in the likelihood of beating revenue goals, a 5% increase to average annual revenue, as well as 10% decrease in overall costs. And these are from studies looking at firms across industries. In addition to that, more broadly, a focus on data can help with things like customer acquisition and retention, customer experience, and more broadly, digital transformation. But the corollary of that is also the intense need for data privacy laws to protect consumers and make sure that the data that they produce is used fairly in a way that doesn't contravene their interests. As I'm sure many of you, I saw that 70% of people are joining from Europe, so I'm sure you're very familiar with GDPR. So this is a regulation set up to protect data privacy. We can actually impose fines as much as 4% of global turnover. So this is really billions of dollars at stake here. And the typical tension we see is between companies' need to monetize their data, as well as this need for consumers to have privacy. But today I'm going to be talking about a third and less commonly commented on avenue, which is actually the data leaked from companies themselves. And by leaked, I don't mean through hacks or through leaving hard drives on trains, planes, and so on, but actually data that companies regularly produce and issue to the public and what that lets us know about them. And this contains both things that are sort of intentional and they mean to communicate, but today we're going to be looking at things that perhaps slip through the cracks and are inadvertently communicated from companies to us. So once upon a time, a company communicating information with the public might look like something like this. In the pit or, in the newspaper, some regular, very intentional, very limited data announcement. That's not how things look anymore. And companies are producing a constant stream of data across social media, their websites, interviews that people give. They're a non-stop source of data. To think about what type of data that is and how we can use it, I'm going to borrow a distinction made in computational social science. This is between the ideas of behavioral residues and identity claims. So what are these? Behavioral residues are things we leave behind from engaging in actions, not necessarily intentionally, but they can be used to learn something about us. So an example of this would be credit card spending data. So obviously not public. If I had your credit card records, I can look at how much money you're spending, where, and so on. And this will teach me something about you as a person, your habits, and so on. The other one of these is identity claims, where this is someone intentionally sharing some kind of information. So you think of like a Facebook status about your favorite sports team. It's just different from behavioral residue because people have some intentionality here. So before we move on, I want to just revisit the actual question of today's research, which is how do companies reveal information about their attitudes towards gender from this data that they produce? So if we revisit that distinction with this in mind, what sort of behavioral residues might teach us something about a company's attitudes towards gender? So one of these is acquisition activity, and another is strategic alliances. So more broadly, we're thinking, what companies do they interact with? And what countries are those companies in? If you look at a company who's making a lot of alliances with companies who are perhaps not gender progressive or in places that are not gender progressive, you might learn something about how much they view that as a priority. Then the other one here that's typically more common in this space is those identity claims. So we can look at personnel changes. Typically, if a company appoints a woman into a senior leadership position, they will make a lot of noise about it. And the fact that they value that and want to be seen as associated with that tells us something about their attitudes to how important they view this, and also the actual language they use when they make such announcements. And that's really the emphasis of my work, is actually what can we learn from a company about the words that they choose when they're describing such issues. And so to think about this, I'm going to talk through a simple example that I think communicates the power of words. So imagine a company hires a senior woman to a position in cybersecurity. One company might say something like, she is a decisive, world-leading expert in cybersecurity. And the other might say she's a careful and experienced cybersecurity executive. Now, both of these are not bad, right? It's not like one of them is completely devaluing the woman's contribution or competency. But these subtle word choices, where you call someone decisive versus careful, can be very powerful and communicate a lot about how that company actually views women in relation to leadership traits. I'm going to keep building on this, so if it's not quite clear yet, don't worry. So to revisit the idea of gender stereotypes, and I'm going to focus on a specific type of gender stereotype regarding whether women are associated with the sort of traits that are seen as necessary to succeed as leaders. Gender stereotypes associate men, but not women, with these achievement-oriented agentic traits, such as being assertive, determined, decisive. And we see this sort of in popular culture. So if you see these examples here, James Bond and Mad Men's Betty Draper, one of them exhibits this sort of assertiveness and decisiveness that's traditionally associated with masculinity, and the other, Betty Draper's very sort of gender conforming stereotypical role, does not. So what's the problem with this? Maybe men are just seen as more agentic, and that doesn't matter. Well, the problem is that leadership positions value and require these agentic traits. And if these are associated with men, but not women, this can create the expectation that men will be more likely to succeed as leaders. And we sort of see this in various places. Like if you look for a stereotypical leader, you get straight pictures of men. And more recently, with the advent of generative models like ChatGPT, these companies have to work really hard to stamp gender biases out of the sort of predictive solutions generated by models. And this has really severe consequences for women, such as the devaluation of their performance at work, the denial of credit for their success, and more broader exclusion in the workplace. So by seeing as not associated with those leadership traits, this really affects how much women are able to succeed and thrive in such roles. So as we revisit this word choice about decisive versus careful, I'm going to make the argument that from the outside, you can learn about how companies are thinking about gender and thinking about that climate to view women as capable leaders or not, from these subtle word choices in the descriptions that they make. So clearly we need some kind of analysis here. You know, we can't just read all of this data because companies are producing it at such a rate that we need to think about what tools do we have to actually engage with that. So I'm going to start with just a high level of what are some of the options that we have when we think about analyzing the language a company uses. One of these is frequency-based methods. So we can count the occurrence of words of interest. This is the oldest form of text analysis and can be very useful for particular tasks. If you want to learn how much a company is talking about risk, to learn if risk seems like an important thing to that company, you can make a dictionary of words related to risk and just count up how much they're used. The problem with something like attitudes is if we just did this for agency, we wouldn't know who was being described as agentic. So it doesn't have that relational property where we know who's being talked about, it just tells you what's being talked about. And the second, and also very commonly used and very powerful method, is topic modeling. So what does this do? Here you run an unsupervised machine learning algorithm, something like LDA, where all you tell it is how many topics to recover in the data. And the algorithm will express each document as a distribution over those topics. So what does this mean? Suppose newspapers only ever talked about the economy or about sports. If we estimated an LDA model with 2 topics, it would express each newspaper's article or edition as what proportion was about the economy and what proportion was about sports. Now we run into the same problem when we think about attitudes here, that it can tell you how much emphasis is placed on some latent topics that are recovered from the data. It doesn't tell you what that's associated with. It doesn't tell you if it's women being described as associated with that or not. And the third method that's going to be the main focus today is word vector-based models. And what these do is express words as a high-dimensional vector in a space. And you can then look at the associations between them to measure the similarity and meaning of different concepts. So if that sounds a bit out there now, we're going to go into much more depth in the following slides. Say we have a question, as we do today, like how similar is the meaning of female-related words, you know, descriptions of women, to the meaning of agentic words? That's those traits that are seen as necessary for leadership success. The basic model logic of these models is captured by this quote from the famous linguist: "You shall know a word by the company it keeps." What this algorithm does is it reads what we call a corpus of text, so, you know, a series of sentences, documents, that might look something like this. So she acted with independence and confidence. When pursuing a goal, she was direct in her approach. Workers thought she was fearless and determined. And it would read this in and learn that references to women, such as the word she, tended to co-occur with concepts such as being independent, direct, and determined, so more broadly, being agentic. And that would be reflected in the similarity of those word vectors in the space. So let's look at, you know, how that looks. We'd run the algorithm, so word to vec or some update, over a corpus of text, and it would express each word in that model as a high dimensional vector. So I've just used 100 dimensions here. It could be 300, could be 500. What we can then do is look at that vector space and see how closely related different vectors are. So just here's a simplification in 2 dimensions. If you had a biased corpus, you might see that an agentic word like independent is more closer in its direction, and so its meaning, to man than woman. And what this tells us something about the gender stereotypes in this company, that typically independence is being more commonly associated with men. I want to just take a pause to reflect on why I think this method is such a breakthrough and is so powerful for organizations and people to be aware of today. It's because unlike these other methods, like frequency-based metrics or topic modeling, we can really view the space that word vectors estimate as sort of similar to a human brain, because each word is placed in its point in this high dimensional space. And the distance between those words, between those ideas, actually captures how similar people view them. That we essentially have a representation of everything a company or a person or whoever's data the model is trained on. We have a network of how they view different concepts as related. And this just has broad capabilities across applications that we're going to talk more about at the end. But for today, I just want you to take away that we're estimating for companies how closely related they view different concepts just from the language that they use. So just to summarize the power of word vectors and how we're thinking about them today, organizations produce large amounts of text data. They're constantly putting this into the public sphere with, across social media, across all kinds of different sources. And we can use this text data to estimate a word vector model for a specific company. So it's not a general model that captures how language is used across firms, but actually how it's used by that company. And for these word vector firms, we can then look into that space and see how closely are women associated with concepts, how closely are men associated with concepts, to get some understanding of the gender stereotypes and attitudes being espoused by those companies. Just to sort of summarize the pipeline, so we take some text, we use that to train these word vectors. There are other elements to the model, but I want you to take away this, that each word is represented as a point in this space. From there, we can look at how those vectors are related to each other, how they are co-located with each other. And the end product is something like this. For each company, we can say how closely are women associated with leadership traits, such as being agentic, for that company. So I'm now going to jump into some of the data that I analyzed in my research, which asks first this question of what's the effect of hiring a woman as CEO on these gender stereotypes? So we took data from S&P companies between 2009 and 2018. So 10-year periods, about 700 companies come into the S&P 500 in that period. It's over 1 billion words of text and around 43,000 documents. So what are those documents? We took things like SEC filings, so annual reports and shareholder proxy votes, as well as transcripts of calls with investors made by those companies to really get a broad sense of the communication of the company, both written as well as oral. And what we did with that was just that pipeline that I discussed with you. And so if you want more details of this, I'm going to show the paper at the end. Essentially, for each of those companies, we did this process to get a measure of how closely women were associated with those agentic leadership traits. But not only did we think about this in general for companies, what we were really interested in here was actually the change. So if you consider these 2 companies, Ulta Beauty and L Brands. Ulta Beauty hired a woman CEO and L Brands did not. This is just a company that's matched based on being similar in terms of industry, in terms of size, and in terms of age, to control for some different factors that might influence how closely women are associated with leadership traits. So in the period prior to this event of hiring a CEO, they looked pretty similar. This association is pretty similar. But on July 1st, 2013, Ulta appointed Mary Dillon as their CEO. What we see in the period post-hire is this association between women and leadership traits increased massively for Ulta Beauty and not so much for L Brands. And why does it increase at all for L brands? Well, this could sort of be time or something like this, right? Like over time, we might hope that these attitudes become more progressive and people view women as more aligned with leaders. But we see importantly that for the company that actually did hire a woman as CEO, that change is much stronger. And if we now look across a sample of companies, we see that this pattern is pretty consistent. So this diagram shows this top row are companies that hired a woman as CEO, and that pre-post, so how strongly women were associated with the traits before the hire and after the hire. And then in those vertical rows, columns, each of these are companies that were matched to that company based on these characteristics. And we see that of these companies that did hire women as CEOs, 70% saw this increase in that association between women and those leadership traits. Whereas for those matched companies that were very similar in other dimensions, only under 30% similarly exhibited this change. And so I'm not going to present it today, but we engaged in a series of statistical analyses across 27,000 different specifications of model parameters. And it really is very robust that there is a significantly greater increase in this association for companies that hired women as CEO. Just as an example of what this might look like, I pulled this out of one of the documents. Mrs. Taylor's supervisory experience in financial management roles makes her an effective member of the audit committee. Word choices like effective versus something else, careful, cautious, experienced, is just showing a bit of that agency and conferring such positive leadership traits to that woman leader that is the sort of positive change that we're seeing in this language. The second question we asked here was, does this positive change where women are seen as more closely aligned with leadership come at the expense of those women being viewed as likable? So I've got the example of Margaret Thatcher up here. There's this idea in gender stereotypes that women trade off being viewed as warm or competent. So women are seen as competent in leadership positions, but there are words like battle axe and ways in which women are stereotyped in those roles that prevent them from being viewed as both likable and competent. So to examine this, we tried to look at which of those agency leadership words were the ones moving the most towards the meaning of being a woman. Is it going to be things like being independent and like being effective, or will it be words like being bossy and dominant and some of the more negative aspects of agency? What we saw was a positive story, where those words that move by the most as being direct, determined, independent, these are all the sort of leadership traits that we would hope would be conferred to women and are characteristics of effective and likable leaders more generally. Just to summarize the findings of this work, we saw that hiring a woman as CEO leads to the meaning of those female words and those leadership traits moving together in vector space, showing that women are being more closely associated with the characteristics necessary for success in such roles. But we had a couple of questions still. So is this general? Will this occur for non-CEO hires? So at the extreme, if you hire a woman to a entry-level role, we clearly don't expect to see a similar change in gender stereotypes. But what about the board? What about middle managers? We don't know from the data so far. The second thing is, along with this, is this just people talking about the new CEO? So those agentic positive traits, is that just them specifically describing the CEO as a woman rather than women more broadly? And so to tackle these questions, we ran a second study where we looked at this at the board level. So we took the same data from those 690 organizations that entered the S&P in that decade, but then we just randomly split them into two groups of 345. So we have to do that because you have to initialize the model and pre-train it to be able to get company-specific models. So we needed text data for that. So we randomly picked 350 companies. And then in addition to looking at how strongly associated with those leadership traits women were, we looked at the proportion of women on the board of directors for those companies. And the benefits of this data were not only that we had many more companies, so 350, but also we could look at the covariation of these two things over time. And I'm going to get slightly more into that on the next slide. So this is just our pipeline again for each of the company years now. So rather than just looking at a company pre and post, we looked at this over time. So in 3 years sliding periods, we looked for each company, how strongly are women associated with those leadership traits for that company in that time period. We use something called panel vector autoregression. I'm not going to get into the details here, but the key thing is this. The proportion of women on the board of directors could feasibly influence these gender stereotypes. That's what we saw in the last data, and that's our hypothesis, that increasing the proportion of women will drop through into more progressive language surrounding women, as well as women being conferred leadership traits. But along with that, it's equally feasible that gender stereotypes determine the likelihood of hiring women themselves. So a company that has more progressive attitudes and sees women more clearly as leaders may also be more likely to hire women onto the board or, in other senior leadership positions. And so what this cross-lagged model lets us do is look at how these two variables affect each other over time to make sure we're not getting reverse causality or some other thing that would confound our interpretation. So as it turns out, we see positive and significant effects both ways. So increasing the proportion of women on the board leads to changes to stereotypes, and also changing those stereotypes leads to future increases the proportion of women on the board. So I'm going to highlight some of the implications of this as we go through the results. Hiring women as leaders is associated with an increased association with those leadership qualities. We saw this with the CEOs, and we were worried maybe it's just at the CEO level, maybe it's just about those specific women. We saw this again at this board level. And I find it more compelling, the idea that this is actually a general shift to how women are seen beyond this specific appointed women, because board members are discussed much less in these company documents. If you read the annual reports, if you read the filings, if you read the transcripts, it's not large sections devoted to each board member, which means if when hiring another woman to the board, we're seeing changes in that language, it seems more likely that this is permeating throughout attitudes across the company. The second thing is this change appears to be driven by positive traits. So we saw it was being direct, it was being determined, it was being independent. These are the traits that women are now being seen as more associated with after entering these leadership roles. It was not being bossy or any kind of thing with negative connotations there. And we do some extra analysis also to see, does women's association with words like being kind and being caring and supportive change? And we don't see that that drops off either. So it really does seem that this change is driven by positive traits. And here's that third point that's sort of intertwined. We're not seeing an expense of being likable. When women are seen as more aligned with leadership roles, they're not seeing any penalty in terms of being seen as sort of helpful and kind. The final point here that we just saw in the cross-lag model is that the stereotype change associated with hiring women may predict hiring more women in the future. And this is in many ways the most exciting result because it highlights the possibility for a virtuous cycle. If we can increase female representation in leadership roles, this can change these gender stereotypes expressed in language that lead to the devaluation of women's performance and impede their career progress. If we can change those stereotypes, this actually predicts hiring more women into the future, and you can see how such a thing would snowball into fighting back against this massive imbalance we see in female representation. So despite being 50% of the population, just 9% of S&P, of Fortune 500 CEOs are women, which is a clear, very far off this parity. But this virtuous cycle could be one pathway by which we can move closer there. So zooming out a bit from the implications for gender per se to thinking more broadly about companies producing data, attitudes, these methods, one of the big takeaways here, as well as sort of the findings of the project, is that people from the outside of an organization can learn about those gender attitudes within companies, which means that attitudes that are not conducive to women's success are detectable and could become a competitive disadvantage. You imagine 4 companies producing this text data, this constant stream of text data. People can do similar analyses to what I presented to you today and actually estimate those attitudes surrounding women and surrounding other issues and use this as an input into the sort of companies they want to apply to. So it's really very important, this public image companies are giving off. It's not just those interviews they give and how people perceive them, but it's actually the insights that are imbued in their data. So in line with this, there's an incentive for companies to hopefully create cultures that are more conducive to women's success. So seeing that this is more transparent, there's more accountability of actually making sure they look internally and look hard at trying to change those attitudes and stamp out those pernicious gender stereotypes. But then another possibility, if you're more of a cynic, is that companies may need to strive to more carefully control the latent attitudes that they're communicating in this text data. Just building on this some more, as I've said, the tools to gain such insights, so these machine learning algorithms like Word2Vec, like these vector models, are freely available to the public. It's not in the hands of a small group. You don't need enormous amounts of computational power, depending on the corpus size. It's something that people can really do, which means companies harboring these backward attitudes, or companies that are unwittingly communicating negative things in this data, should clean house soon, because someone in that big world of people who has these tools and has this capability may identify that soon, and then you can no longer control that insight. So today I've been talking about these specific gender stereotypes, but in principle, with the same approach, many other questions and topics can be probed from the outside. We can see this company's understandings of the relationships between different concepts. So if you think about how closely a company sees pharmaceuticals as related to innovation, as related to control, different things, there's profoundly insightful things to be able to learn that may be able to predict future company activity. So as well as for companies themselves, just thinking about analytics and asset pricing, there's very important information. I just want to round out with thinking about these implications of this method. I started by talking about how companies publicly share masses of data every day, this sort of data leakage inadvertently from the things that they say and from the things that they do. They actually produce enough data that we can map a vector space that captures their view of the world. Remember, I had this sort of picture of the neurons. Some parts of this space will be intentional. So companies know what they're doing when they're communicating. They are intentional with their word choices, and they do think about how they want to present themselves. But this may not be true of this entire space. There may be points in this space that leak insights about the company's attitudes and future actions inadvertently. And so this made me think of this question, which I just want to take a second to think on, is should companies issue less data? It's worth thinking about, because I think people see it as innocuous, another post, another tweet, another LinkedIn story or so on, and that as sort of marketing and engagement with the public. But when it has the potential to sort of give away all of these things, this company culture, this company view that can be used to predict the company's actions, to understand their actions in a not necessarily controlled way, it's something worth thinking about. Should companies issue less data? But I don't want to detract from the key topic we've been discussing here, which is there are clear benefits when you appoint women to senior leadership positions, such as CEO, or to the board of directors, in mitigating pernicious gender stereotypes in language that impede women's progress. We see that those can be changed just by increasing that female representation, which I think to me is a very hopeful story that, this is a battle that we can win. This is the actual research article that I've been talking through today. If you're interested in any of those analytical details, I would refer you to there. With that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Professor Lawson, for running us through this very diligent and thoroughly constructed research and the insights from it. Would invite our audience of more than 100 guests here to also use chat to share your insights and learnings, or actually also your resonance from what you've heard so far, while I'm moving over to officially launching the Q&A session. The first question to you, Asher, is what actually was the original main motivation behind your researching this topic? What initiated the passion, or why are you so passionate about it?
Yeah, thank you. So at this point, it's important to note that this is working collaboration with Sandra Matz at Columbia, Ashley Martin at Stanford, as well as Imral Huda at Chicago, because we were a team talking about what can we do in this space? What is the potential of this method to learn about organizations, to learn about society? This was combined with us being constantly faced with things like this underrepresentation of women in senior leadership roles, and like my colleagues' experience of being, the only woman in the room in all kinds of technical positions and situations. And so combined with this, we were like, well, how can that change? And an obvious thing to think about was these gender stereotypes that are meaning when people think who should be in those rooms, they're not thinking women. And so we thought, how can this change? Well, we thought, first let's just see when women are entered into those spaces, does anything change, or is there actually just backlash that inhibits them from sort of being conferred these positive leadership traits? And from there, that's sort of where this design spiraled out. But my passion really does come from that, specifically looking at the CEO at the highest level of the people sort of making decisions in these companies that in many ways drive society. To be 9% women is just so far off parity that I still feel that this is sort of an ugly statistic that we should all feel ashamed of in some sense, or at least motivated to try and change.
And so if you were appointed as CEO today, would be able to drive or catalyze that systemic change that you alluded towards, what measures would you introduce in your first 100 days of tenure? What, in your view, are the biggest obstacles for women to thrive in organizations based on your findings?
Thank you. So look, of course, everything I say should be taken with a pinch of salt. If I was a CEO, I think perhaps this company would be in trouble. But thinking one of the big criticisms of the issues with hiring women into leadership roles is that there's not a corresponding effort to create a culture and environment that's conducive to their success. There's a few things. So one, there's something called the glass cliff phenomenon, which says that women are more likely to be hired into precarious roles. So these are sort of executive positions that are set up to fail. The company's on the way down. And the problem with this is then if women do take such roles and the company fails, as it was already going to, the critics can sort of hold this up as evidence of, this is the women's fault and so on. But the other thing, and perhaps the problem that if I were an executive in this position, I would fight really hard against, is really that culture of you cannot appoint a woman leader and also undercut her and not empower her. You have to think very strongly about, if you see any pockets of backward gender attitudes, of trying to stamp these out through training, but also with good female representation in such roles. I believe some of these changes will just occur from seeing successful women leadership. There are many people whose sort of gender stereotypes and attitudes have been changed just by viewing it in practice. So I think I would consider gender quotas as one means to make sure that people are exposed to positive examples of women leadership, as well as training and other measures to try and change culture surrounding this, to make sure that attitudes that could negatively affect women's ability to succeed are sort of stamped out. I think that's my two, yeah.
Thank you. I want to read out some questions from the audience. One is from Silke. She asked, did you also see the reverse effect? If a company changed from a female CEO to a male CEO, did you see discussion of leadership related words with female words, or is the change stable once it has been established in a company?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So we did conduct an analysis of cases in that decade in the S&P 500 where a woman CEO was replaced with a man. It's very rare, so it happened twice. And the problem is it's quite hard to draw a statistical conclusion from two companies, well, impossible, in fact. But we did not see, it didn't decrease for both. It decreased for one and stayed the same for one. So hard to say, but I will say more broadly about the time dynamics of this. What's quite interesting is if you look in the period pre-hire, you don't see any spike in the change in attitude. So if we look at just 6 months, either side of the hiring date, but what you do see after a woman is appointed is it actually accrues. So it's not sort of like a step where, companies make a lot of effort early on and then this sort of falls off. You actually see over time this accumulating and gradually increasing, that after 3 years, there's sort of a peak and then it plateaus around that. So at least with the limited evidence I have, I see that these changes do seem to sort of accrue in a way that feels more stable than if companies sort of day one after hire are making a lot of intentional effort that then drops off. It's a great question, and one that sadly we don't have the data to more significantly address. So yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
Thank case for assessing the return on investment in certain systemic changes. I want to get your attention towards the Q&A box, also to our audience. There's a function to upvote questions that are being asked in there, and then we will read out the questions in the ranking, according to the ranking, so you all can participate in creating and curating the questions for us to address. Philip has asked the question, or the introduction to the question is: senior executives become the outward face of the company institution. Irrespective of internal gender intent, female leaders often face greater resistance from society in general. Two very powerful women, Jacinda Ardern and Nicola Sturgeon, have recently stepped down in ways men rarely do. How do you view these developments?
Yeah, it's also a great question, and one that could be tackled in a number of ways. So I think, this is a great barrier. So when I talk with executives and various people about this, a big problem is if we think as a company that this is important, it doesn't mean our stakeholders will. So many industries, homophily is very important, that if all your clients are men, for example, they may be more comfortable with a man in a role, and that can create a sort of, in some way, artificial performance cost to a woman, right? Because if the people that you're facing are biased, then this is something that you're up against and may be unable to overcome. So it's a big problem, companies navigating a sort of stakeholder network where there are biases that even if you fix your own company's biases, you can't overcome them in society or in every sort of party that you have to interact with. And so the way I think about this is it's a short-term, long-term problem. So this is a lot a function of historical gender biases, of historical underrepresentation, but we're already seeing a change here. So in the short term, there may not be a business case due to issues with stakeholders. But in the long term, this is clearly going to be essential, and there are going to be massive benefits to really unlocking the power of diversity, meaning the companies that are early movers here are going to have a massive benefit in that context. So it's really a case of, are you thinking in 5 years or 50 years? And I think any company trying to succeed should be thinking on that long-term horizon, the building this competency early, meaning being able to recruit and retain successful women, successful underrepresented minority candidates, and also create a culture conducive to their success is really a long-term competency that is going to ensure continued success, even if there is some resistance in the short term. So I think the question in some way was maybe had two parts, just because that is number one. And number two, this thing about stepping down from leadership and self-care and things like that, I think this is part of a broader movement in society that's not limited to gender. So if you look at like the English cricket team, a number of sort of high-profile male players have taken mental health breaks. And in the last year, 2 years, this has become destigmatized in a way we've never seen before. That is a massive positive for society. So I would say, so far, maybe in politics, we've only seen this for prominent women leaders. But I think in the period coming, I wouldn't be surprised to see this with male leaders, as we've seen with male sportsmen. And so I don't necessarily see that as a gendered per se, but I'm unclear. Well, there is another part in there, which is the response to it may be gendered. But so I do believe in the immediate future, we may see male leaders taking a similar step. But yes, some of the media treatment of those figures was disgusting, and saying, I remember this headline, women can't have it all, to witness this. I mean, what can you say about the tabloids, huh? But I think, clearly there are still massive gender stereotypes in society, and particular groups like tabloid newspapers, fake news peddlers, who just want to drive reaction with posts, so sort of rage and all these things, will continue to manipulate them. This is a big problem we have in society, people driving engagement through getting people angry and furious in all kinds of ways, which I think goes beyond gender, but sadly is still evidence of those prominent biases being crystallized in society.
In essence, it's a little bit of a race between academia and technologists. The more we know, the easier we can hack the system too. It's about how do we use these tools in a way we find ethical. I guess that's a question related to each organization and those stakeholders engaged in the fields of opinion shaping. We have a question here from Paola about, have you done a research on how the maternity leave and children caring policies in different countries affect the hiring of women in leadership positions?
So I have not personally, but something I can speak to a little bit is I have some data on a future project I'm working on that actually shows having female women in senior leadership positions is negatively associated with childcare opportunities in organizations. So why is this? We're still working through different possible hypotheses. But I mean, one is, in some sense, successful women leaders are likely to have had to sacrifice a lot of time over the years, and may or may not have prioritized family, meaning that they may view that others can do the same. And this is an unfortunate artifact of the patriarchy in society, that is one possible attitude. The other is there's a great issue with women and minorities who are hired into leadership positions. Is because these are traditionally sort of white male spheres, there's a very strong pressure not to sort of favor one's own in-group, which means many women who are able to attain leadership positions, if they started doing things that obviously favor women, this could lead to massive reputational risk in losing those positions. That there are many tensions working on people in those roles that can inhibit actually fueling broader change. But in response to the question, which was about the effect of the policy on the hiring, I don't have data to speak to that, but I'm sure it would make an interesting study.
Thank you. So many new avenues for research, just inspired by today's talk. We have a question here, whether this approach that you use could actually be used to measure the impact of diversity initiatives inside an organization. Or have you seen any kind of work in a similar field?
I've not seen work in a similar field. So this is a tool that entered computer science under 10 years ago, and, sort of drips through to the social sciences more slowly. I would say if a company was incentivized to do that, it's absolutely possible. The design would be something like this. You take your internal corpus of email data, and if you're a large company, you have 100,000 employees, they're sending millions of emails a week, which means for each week of the year, you could estimate this embedding model and look at how women are being associated with different traits and different buckets of words. And then you could look at pre-post when you're launching your interventions. Are you seeing changes in those variables? So as an academic, very hard to do, because getting fine-grained and voluminous data from companies, it's obviously private. There are many issues that mean a company is unlikely to share such data with me. But in a company, if you wanted to look at how are people talking about women or minorities or different groups as a function of those trainings, whilst maintaining those people's anonymity, right? Because if you train the model on the email corpus, you're not then like isolating specific people and saying you're a sexist and you're not, and so on. That would be very possible and not even that expensive to do. And if there's anyone with a company who wants someone to help them do this and write up a study of it, you know where I'll be.
So maybe this question links to what you just mentioned. And just to clarify, if we were companies, how would we use technologies like machine learning processes to actually even increase the agency, the positive agency traits for certain stakeholder groups within the company? Like, how could we actually directly intervene into the shaping of perceptions?
Thank you. Yeah, so it's a great question. I think, in my view, algorithms like this, they are unlikely to drive change themselves, but what they do is hold up a reflection of you in the mirror, right? So if you imagine you estimate this on your own company's internal data, you can see specifically what traits of women are associated with versus not, right? suppose there are different facets of agency, like, being powerful versus being intelligent. You can map all of that out to get a very fine-grained understanding of the words that are and aren't associated with women in your organizations or with other groups in your organizations. But the actual changing of that to increase that agency, we still have to go back to our conventional tools, like training sessions, like seeing women exhibit such traits and so on. But I think where it can be very beneficial is that targeting, right? Because rather than saying we want to increase diversity or we want to improve attitudes, it can really, so in a sophisticated way, it can really show you specifically what those attitudes are and where your danger areas are, right? Because imagine you may make progress in some spaces and not others. And you can also, the other nice thing is you can really track if you're having any backlash effects here. Because suppose a big concern is you put people in diversity training every week, they get sick of it. And they may be, go and be saying negative things. And, probably no one in this call, but I'm sure there are people like this. And so the other thing about estimating such models longitudinally in your company is you can see if after a diversity session, there's a spike in people being negative about such things, you'd be able to pick that up and try and mitigate that, because ultimately the net benefit we have here is those positive changes for people who want to change and just sort of need the information and the jolt, but also sort of people who are getting pushed in the other directions. The company has to net all of that to actually move in a positive direction. So in not just a one-line summary to your question, is it can't make the changes itself, but can provide you very fine-grained information to target that for the specific issues that your company has.
Thank you. We'll have a little bit of a technical question here, but it's also really amazing that we have a technical person in front of us. Gianluca is asking or saying he's also involved in running NLP, natural language processing models. And one challenge he faces is to attribute a positive versus negative sentiment to a topic. How could one associate those traits with positive rather than negative mention?
Sorry, yeah, so the question, perhaps, if I'm hearing it right, is about negation, meaning perhaps people are saying she is not powerful. And how do you control for that? So there are various academic approaches to this. I mean, you can look at bigrams, so you can try and look at two words rather than looking at individual words. You can run some kind of regex approach to this to try and look how often is that preceding that word. And this is a problem that's still debated in CS now, as a sort of fine-grained use of things. I mean, among others, another problem that comes up a lot is there are words like fair that can mean different things. So fair can mean like just, it can also mean beautiful. And so trying to deal with multiple different meanings is something that advanced models in NLP like BERT try to be able to do to disentangle those fine-grained things. So it really depends on your question of interest, is perhaps beyond the scope of the talk, but really, as you say, yep, great to hear we have engagement like that in the room. So thank you.
Yeah, so it's almost close to the hour, and would love to wrap up today's session with the invite for you, Professor Lawson, to share with us if there's like one thing you really want us to take away and into our organization from today's session. What is it?
So it's that your company is producing data. That data can be used internally or externally to map fine-grained understanding of the associations between different concepts. Moving forward, we've got to think about the value you can extract from that, and also the information that you're communicating to stakeholders via that. I would say that's my main takeaway.
Thank you so much for this most engaging and insightful sharing of today. INSEAD Tech Talk X will have future sessions within the next few weeks, with the next one being about the metaverse. So everyone is welcome to rejoin this wonderful series of talks. And again, thank you, Professor Lawson. Thank you very much, Digital at INSEAD, by Pascal and Sandra. And thank you everyone else for joining us today. Also very happy about the new ranking that was published yesterday. And I hope everyone is also celebrating together wherever you are. Have a wonderful day, night, afternoon ahead, and hopefully see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Yip, and thank everyone.